October 28th, 2022. It's just past noon on a Friday in Pittsburgh. Inside the Destiny of Faith Church on Brighton Road, family and friends have gathered to say goodbye to 20-year-old John Hornezes Jr. The service is quiet, respectful. People are grieving for a young man whose life ended too soon just 13 days earlier. The church sits in Brighton Heights, a neighborhood that's seen its share of struggles, but where people still come together to support each other through difficult times. Outside, mourners stand near the church entrance on Benton Avenue, some smoking cigarettes with shaking hands, others just talking quietly about John before heading inside to pay their final respects. The afternoon is cool, typical for late October in Pittsburgh. People are wearing their best clothes, dark suits, black dresses, the kind of outfits you only put on for the most solemn occasions. Then, without warning, two figures dressed in black appear on the street. They're wearing masks that completely hide their faces, and they start shooting, not one or two shots, not even a handful. A witness would later tell police he heard 40 to 50 gunshots in a matter of minutes, the sound echoing off the buildings and mixing with screams of terror. People scatter in every direction. They run toward the church doors. They duck behind cars. They throw themselves to the ground. Some mourners inside the church hear the gunfire and rush toward the windows, trying to understand what's happening. Others drop to the floor inside the sanctuary, afraid the shooters might come inside. When the shooting finally stops, 6 people are lying wounded on the ground outside this house of worship. One person is fighting for their life in critical condition. Quick question before we continue. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from right now. But this funeral shooting didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't random violence by strangers. It started exactly 13 days earlier with a triple murder at a gas station that would shock Pittsburgh and set off a chain of violence that nobody saw coming. This is Accused, where we dig into the cases that expose the truth behind the headlines. If you're new here and want the untold stories behind the headlines, hit that subscribe button. Today we're looking at a case that shows how one shooting can spiral into another, how a funeral can become a crime scene, and how innocent people get caught in cycles of violence they never asked to be part of. We've got the surveillance footage analysis, the police reports that weren't released to the public, and the community connections that reveal exactly how this tragedy unfolded. We've talked to people who knew the victims, people who witnessed these events, and people who understand how street conflicts can explode into deadly violence. This is the story of how a gas station shooting became a church massacre, and how 2 innocent women died simply because they were waiting for a bus at the wrong time. John James Hornezes Jr. turned 20 years old in the summer of 2022. His family described him as someone trying to make his way in a tough world. Like many young men in Pittsburgh's North Side, John grew up knowing that the streets could be dangerous, that conflicts could turn deadly, that you had to be careful about where you went and who you associated with. But John wasn't just a street kid. He had family who cared about him, people who were hoping he could find a path away from the violence that claimed too many young lives in his neighborhood. On October 15, 2022, he probably thought he was safe enough. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when people run errands, visit friends, handle the normal business of daily life. John was in the area of Cedar Avenue in a neighborhood called Deutschtown. This part of Pittsburgh sits between the Allegheny River and the North Side proper. It's a mix of old row houses, small businesses, and vacant lots. Cedar Avenue itself has seen better days. Some of the buildings are boarded up, others are hanging on as family businesses or corner stores. The Sunoco gas station in the 300 block of Cedar Avenue is one of those places where people from the neighborhood stop for gas, cigarettes, lottery tickets, or just to hang out for a few minutes. But this isn't exactly a quiet suburban street where nothing ever happens. Cedar Avenue has seen its share of violence over the years, the kind of shootings that make the local news for a day or two before everyone moves on to the next tragedy. But what happened that Saturday afternoon shocked even longtime residents who thought they'd seen everything. because when the shooting started at that Sunoco station, it wasn't just John who got caught in the crossfire. Two completely innocent women who had absolutely nothing to do with whatever conflict was playing out would lose their lives. Betty Averitt was 59 years old. She had grown children, grandchildren, a whole life built over nearly 6 decades. Jacqueline Mahalik was 33. She was young, probably had dreams and plans that would never be fulfilled. These two women were simply waiting for a bus. They were standing at or near a bus stop, minding their own business, probably checking their phones or watching for their ride to arrive. They were in the wrong place at the worst possible time, and their deaths would make this case even more complicated, even more tragic, because now police weren't just dealing with street violence between people who knew each other. They were dealing with the murder of two innocent bystanders whose only mistake was needing public transportation on a Saturday afternoon. The days and weeks leading up to October 15th were tense in certain circles on Pittsburgh's North Side. There had been conflicts, disagreements, the kind of disputes that can simmer for months before they explode into violence. Some of these conflicts go back years: family feuds, neighborhood rivalries, disputes over territory or respect or money. When you talk to people who understand street culture, they'll tell you that these situations can be incredibly complex. Someone disrespects someone else, a rumor spreads, a social media post gets misinterpreted, a business deal goes wrong, people choose sides, tensions build, and when everyone involved has access to guns and some people are willing to use them, small conflicts can become deadly very quickly. Police would later piece together that the Cedar Avenue shooting wasn't a random act of violence. There were specific people involved, specific reasons, specific targets. John Hornezes Jr. was somehow connected to whatever was brewing on the streets. Maybe he was directly involved in a conflict. Maybe he was associated with people who were involved, or maybe he just found himself in the middle of something that spiraled out of control. By the second week of October 2022, multiple surveillance cameras around the Cedar Avenue area were about to capture something horrific. Different people were converging on that Sunoco station, and the situation was about to explode in the worst way possible. Some of them probably knew what was coming. Others, like Betty Averitt and Jacqueline Mahalik, had no idea they were walking into the middle of a deadly confrontation. October 15th, 2022, Saturday afternoon. The weather was mild for mid-October in Pittsburgh, the kind of day when people don't mind being outside. The Sunoco gas station on Cedar Avenue was probably busy with its usual mix of customers, people filling up their cars, buying snacks, cigarettes, beer. Betty Averitt and Jacqueline Mahalik were at or near the bus stop, waiting for public transportation. John Hornezes Jr. was in the area, though exactly why he was there and what led to the confrontation isn't entirely clear from public records. What is clear is that multiple people with guns converged on that location, and what happened next turned a busy afternoon into a crime scene. Based on police reports, court documents, and witness statements, here's what we know. Shots rang out at the Sunoco station. The shooting was rapid, violent, and deadly. When it was over, 3 people were dead, and a 4th person was wounded but survived. John Hornezes Jr., who was apparently the primary target or at least directly involved in whatever conflict led to this shooting, was killed. But so were Betty Averitt and Jacqueline Mahalik, 2 women who were just trying to get home and had nothing to do with street disputes or personal conflicts. They were what police call innocent bystanders, people who died simply because they were in the wrong place when someone else's violence exploded. The scene after the shooting was chaos. Emergency responders rushed to the Cedar Avenue area. 3 ambulances, multiple police cars, crime scene investigators, detectives. The gas station was cordoned off with yellow tape. The 2 innocent victims were rushed to the hospital, but their injuries were too severe. They died, leaving behind families who would never understand why their loved ones had to die in someone else's war. John's family got the phone call that no parent ever wants to receive. Your child has been shot. Your child is dead. You need to come identify the body. And in that moment, through their shock and grief, they had to start thinking about funeral arrangements. But as we now know, that funeral would become another crime scene, another tragedy, another example of how violence breeds more violence. Question for you. You're planning a funeral for a loved one killed in street violence. Police offer security, but can't guarantee complete safety. People are telling you there might be retaliation at the service. Do you A. Proceed with a public funeral to honor them properly and let the community say goodbye? B. Hold a small private ceremony to protect the mourners who want to attend? Or C. Delay the funeral until tensions cool down and hope that actually happens? Keep in mind, there's no right answer here, just an impossible choice that John's family had to make while they were grieving the loss of their son. Pittsburgh police immediately launched a major investigation into the Cedar Avenue shooting. Homicide detectives were assigned to the case, experienced investigators who had worked similar cases before and understood the complexities of street violence. They started collecting surveillance footage from the Sunoco station and nearby businesses. In a case like this, video evidence can be crucial. It can show who was there, what happened, who fired shots, how the victims ended up in the line of fire. But surveillance footage is only useful if the cameras were working, if they were pointed in the right direction, and if the image quality is good enough to identify people and understand the sequence of events. Detectives also started interviewing witnesses, though as often happens in these cases, many people were reluctant to talk. The North Side community has a complicated relationship with law enforcement. People want justice for innocent victims, like Betty Averett and Jacqueline Mahalik, but they also fear retaliation for cooperating with police. In neighborhoods where street conflicts can turn deadly, being labeled a snitch can put your own life at risk. So detectives had to work carefully, building trust, protecting sources, piecing together what happened from people who might only know part of the story, or who might be afraid to tell everything they saw. The investigators knew they were dealing with something bigger than a simple dispute between two people. 3 people dead, including 2 innocent victims, suggested this was part of ongoing street conflicts that involved multiple people and might not be over. They started mapping connections between the people involved, looking at social media posts, tracking down leads from informants and community sources. Within days, they had identified suspects in the shooting. Jalone Hines and other individuals were being investigated in connection with the murders. Police started building cases against them, gathering evidence, preparing for arrests. But while detectives were building their case through the legal system, something else was happening on the streets. People connected to John Hornezes Jr. were angry about his death. They wanted revenge against whoever killed him, and they knew that John's funeral was coming up fast, a public event where people connected to the shooting might show up to pay their respects or cause trouble. The Hornezes family faced an impossible decision that no family should ever have to make. They wanted to honor their son with a proper funeral, a chance for family and friends to pay their respects and say goodbye. John deserved a service that reflected his life, that brought together the people who knew and cared about him. But they also knew that tensions were high on the streets, that whoever killed John might not be done with violence, that his funeral could become a target for retaliation or additional conflicts. They had to balance their need to grieve publicly with their responsibility to keep mourners safe. After discussing their options, they chose the Destiny of Faith Church on Brighton Road in the Brighton Heights neighborhood. It's a small church, not particularly fancy, but it's in a community where John had connections and where his family felt comfortable. The church sits on the corner of Brighton Road and Benton Avenue, a location that's accessible by public transportation and parking, but also somewhat exposed to the street. The family reached out to Pittsburgh police about security for the service. This wasn't an unusual request. Police sometimes provide security for funerals of shooting victims, especially when there are concerns about ongoing conflicts. According to later reports, Reverend Bragg specifically requested police presence at the funeral. She had been in the community long enough to understand that this could be dangerous, that John's death might not be the end of the violence. Police agreed to provide security, but in a city dealing with limited resources, ongoing investigations, and multiple demands on officer time, it's not clear how much protection they could realistically offer for the entire service. The funeral was scheduled for Friday, October 28th, exactly 13 days after John was killed on Cedar Avenue. As that day approached, people in the community were nervous. Everyone hoped the service would go peacefully, that people could grieve without fear, that respect for the dead and the sacred space of a church would prevent further violence. But hope doesn't stop bullets, and respect doesn't always matter to people who are angry enough to kill. October 28th, 2022, Friday morning turning into afternoon. The Destiny of Faith Church is filling up with mourners. John's immediate family sits in the front rows. His mother, other relatives, people who raised him and loved him and are now trying to say goodbye. Behind them sit friends from the neighborhood, people who knew John from school or work or just from growing up in the same area. There are also people who didn't know John well, but came to support the family, to show solidarity with a community that has lost too many young people to violence. The service is emotional but respectful. People share memories of John, talk about his life, pray for his soul, and for comfort for his family. Outside the church, some mourners stand near the entrance on Benton Avenue, either waiting to go inside for the service or just taking a break from the emotional weight of a funeral. Some people are smoking cigarettes, trying to calm their nerves. Others are talking quietly about John, sharing stories, or just offering each other support. The afternoon is cool but not cold, typical weather for late October in Pittsburgh. People are wearing their best clothes, dark suits, black dresses, the formal attire that shows respect for the deceased and the solemnity of the occasion. Just after noon, while the service is still ongoing inside the church, two figures appear on Benton Avenue near the church entrance. They're dressed completely in black clothing that covers most of their bodies. More importantly, they're wearing masks that completely hide their faces, not medical masks, but the kind of covering that someone wears when they don't want to be identified. And they're armed with guns. According to police reports and witness statements that came out later, these two suspects started shooting toward people who were standing at the front doors of the church and in the vestibule area just inside the entrance. One of the shooters ran directly toward the church entrance and kept firing at the victims, showing a level of aggression and intent that suggests this wasn't random or impulsive, but planned and targeted. The reverend inside the church would later tell local news reporters that he heard 40 to 50 shots fired in what felt like just a few minutes. Think about that for a moment. 40 to 50 gunshots outside a church during a funeral service. That's not a quick burst of gunfire. That's sustained shooting, multiple reloads, a deliberate attempt to cause maximum damage. People inside the service hear the shooting and immediately panic. Some mourners rush toward the windows, trying to understand what's happening outside. Others drop to the floor inside the sanctuary, afraid that the shooters might come inside the church itself. The sound of gunfire during a funeral is something that stays with people forever, the contrast between trying to honor the dead and suddenly facing the possibility of joining them. Outside, mourners scatter in every direction, running for cover, trying to get away from the gunfire. Some people dive behind parked cars. Others run toward the church building, hoping the brick walls will provide protection. A few people try to help the victims who have been shot, but that means exposing themselves to ongoing gunfire. The shooting scene outside the church is chaos. People screaming, running, bleeding, trying to help others while protecting themselves. 6 people are hit by gunfire during this attack. Their ages, backgrounds, and exact injuries haven't all been made public, but we know that one person ended up in critical condition at the hospital, fighting for their life. The others suffered various injuries that required emergency medical treatment. The shooting happens fast, probably less than 2 minutes from the first shot to the last, though those 2 minutes must have felt like hours to the people who lived through it. Then, as suddenly as it started, the shooting stops. The two suspects run away from the scene, leaving 6 wounded people bleeding on the ground outside a church where a mother was trying to bury her son. They disappear into the neighborhood, probably having planned their escape route before they ever arrived at the church. Emergency responders rush to the scene for the second time in less than 2 weeks. More ambulances, more police cars, more crime scene tape around another location connected to John Hornezes Jr. But this time, it's outside a house of worship during a funeral service, which crosses every line of decency that most people recognize, even in neighborhoods that have seen a lot of violence. Pittsburgh police immediately launched an intensive investigation into the church shooting. They had surveillance footage from cameras in the area that showed the two suspects approaching the church and opening fire on the mourners. Video evidence like this can be crucial in identifying suspects and building a criminal case, especially when witnesses might be afraid to testify. Detectives also collected shell casings from the scene, which can provide ballistic evidence linking specific guns to the shooting. They interviewed witnesses who were at the funeral and saw the attack, though many people were traumatized and their memories of the chaotic few minutes might not be perfectly clear. Within just a few days, police arrested 19-year-old Sean Davis and a 16-year-old whose name wasn't released to the public because he's a minor. Both were charged with attempted homicide, criminal conspiracy, aggravated assault, and weapons charges. The speed of these arrests suggests that police had strong evidence, probably video footage showing the suspects' faces or other identifying information, maybe witnesses who could identify them, possibly even tips from people in the community who were outraged that someone would shoot up a funeral. Police also started investigating whether this shooting was directly connected to the original Cedar Avenue murders that killed John Hornezes Jr. It seemed obvious that someone was targeting people connected to John, even at his own funeral, but proving the connection in court requires solid evidence, not just logical assumptions. Meanwhile, the 6 shooting victims were in various Pittsburgh hospitals, recovering from their injuries, and the trauma of being shot while trying to pay their respects to a young man who died too soon. One person remained in critical condition for days, their family unsure whether they would survive. The community around the Destiny of Faith Church was shaken in a way that's hard to describe. Even in neighborhoods that have experienced violence, shooting up a funeral crosses a line that most people consider sacred. Churches are supposed to be safe spaces. Funerals are supposed to be times when even enemies respect the dead and let families grieve in peace. But that's exactly what was violated on October 28, 2022. The investigation into both shootings continued through the fall of 2022 and into the new year. Police eventually arrested multiple suspects in connection with the original Cedar Avenue shooting that killed John Hornezes Jr., Betty Averett, and Jacqueline Mahalik. Jalone Hines was among those charged in that case. The legal process in cases like these is complex and can take years to work through the courts. There are preliminary hearings, grand jury proceedings, plea negotiations, and potentially trials. Each defendant has their own attorney, their own legal strategy, their own version of events. The families of the victims have to relive the trauma repeatedly as the cases move through the system. The funeral shooting case moved forward with charges against Sean Davis and the juvenile suspect. Prosecutors had to prove not just that they committed the shooting, but that they did so with the intent to kill, that they conspired together to plan the attack, and that they knew their actions could result in serious injury or death. The surveillance footage and witness testimony would be crucial pieces of evidence, but building a case that can withstand scrutiny in court requires careful investigation and preparation. Meanwhile, the families of all the victims were left to process their grief and trauma. Betty Averett's family had to cope with losing a 59-year-old woman who died simply because she was waiting for a bus at the wrong time. Jacqueline Mahalik's family faced the same incomprehensible loss, their 33-year-old loved one killed by someone else's violence. John's family had to process not only his death, but also the fact that his funeral became another crime scene, that people were shot while trying to honor his memory. The 6 people wounded outside the church had to recover from their physical injuries and the psychological trauma of experiencing a mass shooting. Some of them might have ongoing medical issues, disability, or PTSD that affects them for years to come. The broader community around both shooting locations, Cedar Avenue and Brighton Road, had to grapple with the reality that violence can erupt anywhere, anytime, affecting anyone. Today, if you drive by the Destiny of Faith Church on Brighton Road, it looks like any other small urban church in Pittsburgh. There's no memorial marker outside, no permanent sign of what happened there on October 28, 2022. The building itself shows no obvious scars from the shooting. Life has moved on, at least on the surface. But the people who were there that day, who heard those 40 to 50 gunshots during a funeral service, will never forget. The families of the victims carry their grief every day. The survivors of the shooting live with whatever physical and emotional scars they sustained. The community members who witnessed these events or knew the people involved are left with questions about how to prevent similar tragedies in the future. In total, this case involved 9 shooting victims across 2 incidents separated by just 13 days. 3 people killed on Cedar Avenue, including John Hornezes Jr., and 6 people wounded outside his funeral. Among the dead were 2 completely innocent women, Betty Averitt and Jacqueline Mahalik, who died simply because they were waiting for a bus near a gas station where other people decided to settle their conflicts with gunfire. Their deaths represent one of the most tragic aspects of street violence, the way it claims innocent lives, destroys families that had nothing to do with whatever disputes led to the shooting, and traumatizes entire communities. How many funerals will become crime scenes before something changes? How many families will have to bury their children while worrying about getting shot at the service? How many innocent people will die because they happened to be in the wrong place when someone else's violence exploded into their world? These are the questions that Pittsburgh, like many American cities, is still trying to answer. The solutions aren't simple or obvious. They involve everything from policing strategies, to community intervention programs, to economic development, to education, to mental health services. But until those broader changes happen, families like the Hornezes will continue to face impossible choices between honoring their dead and protecting the living. Tomorrow, we'll be looking at another case that shows how quickly everyday situations can spiral out of control when people choose violence over other ways of handling conflict. If cases like this matter to you, if you want to understand how these tragedies unfold and what might prevent them, subscribe to Accused for the investigations and analysis that mainstream media won't do. John Hornezes Jr. was 20 years old when he died on Cedar Avenue. Betty Averitt was 59. Jacqueline Mahalik was 33. They deserved better than to become statistics in a cycle of violence that seems to have no end. They deserved to live full lives, to see their dreams fulfilled, to grow old surrounded by people who loved them. Instead, they became victims of conflicts they may not have even understood, casualties in wars they didn't choose to fight.